We are on the last and final episode for Decolonise Me. This is the last of the season, and for this episode, we are talking about gender and sexuality. Our special guest for today is Dr. Shawna Tang, and in this episode, we talk a lot, and it is such a rich conversation. We talk about how gender and race are very much linked, and I learned MCGS, modern colonial gender systems. Boom. And that was actually the starting point of our conversation, and talked a lot about what we think of as the normative, the heteronormative way, the default human. What do we consider as the default, as the normal, and how then people are othered in that process. If you don't fit the mold, then you don't belong. What else did we talk about, Chuchi?
Heaps of stuff. So we
Yeah.
talked about redefining the way in which we understand gender and sexuality from different feminist perspectives. We
And also the risk in that.
yes.
Yeah, just minor risk.
Yeah, that's right. Whilst also looking at how do we create a shared understanding of gender and sexuality beyond the exotification and the orientalization of
and
it.
romanticizing.
The romanticizing, but also understanding how those elements of our identity can influence and shape our lived and living experience. So when we got to the challenge, we talked about those different areas as well, looking at how those perspectives take shape and how they form our realities.
Yeah, so check it out and give it a listen.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 6.
Final episode. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun.
Of Decolonise Me, where we strive to deconstruct, decolonize, and disrupt. I have a thing for D words.
Yes, and alliterations.
That's the one.
Mhm.
On this episode, we have a special guest that's joined us to speak about gender and sexuality. Please join us in welcoming Dr.
Dr.
Shawna
Shawna
Tang. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show, and I'm very happy to be here. I work in the University of Sydney. I'm senior lecturer in gender and cultural studies. I grew up in Singapore, and moved to Sydney both for the PhD and then later for a job. So this is actually my second stint in Sydney.
Mm.
And it's a lovely city. Glad to be back and really enjoying my work here, teaching gender and cultural studies to students at this university.
Just out of interest, where was your first stint as an academic?
Yeah, so after I completed my PhD here, I went back to the National University of Singapore
Mhm.
Yeah.
for my postdoctoral fellowship.
Yeah.
And then as a faculty on in the sociology department at the National University of Singapore.
Yeah, awesome.
And then came back here because kind of missed living in the city. And also really for my queerness, I just felt that it was hard to really live out my queerness in Singapore. My gender non-normativity was not that accepted in Singapore. I was kind of chased out in public toilets and sort of stared down in public buses and hawker centers. And then my partner and I decided that if we have enough of this, let's try to make our way back to Sydney, where we felt we could live more freely as a queer couple.
Wow.
Singapore has changed since then,
Mhm.
but at that time there was sort of rising Christian conservatism, and so even going to the cafe was kind of difficult because we presented so clearly as a queer couple. And so we felt a lot of these constraints and felt that we wanted to come back to Sydney.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
your
Thank
journey
you.
with us. And we appreciate you being able to provide insights into your own lived and living experience. let's get into the first part of our conversation, furthering
Mhm.
some of those bigger picture perspectives. In this first section, we're going to deconstruct. So we're going to try and understand what we currently know and understand around gender and sexuality. So what are some of the things that we know and or understand and even practice around gender and sexuality?
Yeah, so one of the dominant ways that we think about these categories of gender and sexuality is that it is a kind of personal identity.
Mhm.
Right? So I've got a lot of students coming into my class saying that I want to be in your class, right? Because I want to understand myself, right? As a particular kind of gender or sort of sexual subject. Yeah. Yeah, so I think this is a sort of dominant understanding of gender and sexuality, but yet these categories function as so much more,
Mm.
right? And if you ask me, gender and sexuality has so much to do with race, right? That is often not talked about.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, if you just think about the making of Western society,
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm, mhm.
right? And what we understand to be Western modernity, right? Which is always sort of which is entangled with the question of colonialism,
Mhm.
right? And a lot of decolonial feminist theorists, someone like Maria Lugones, they have said that Western modernity, right, or Western society as we know it, is built on a sort of colonial gender system, right? Where on the one side you have this sort of European bourgeoisie man who is heterosexual, Christian, and this subject and agent of public life,
Mhm.
right? And also this subject and agent of reason and civilization,
Mhm.
right? Who is deemed fit to rule, to lead, and to participate in public life, right? So, and then on the other hand, you've got this bourgeoisie European woman whose role is not equal to or the same as the Western bourgeoisie man, but someone who is complementary, right? Who plays this reproductive role, reproducing race and capital in service of the white European bourgeoisie man. Right? So at the heart of this system, a lot of decolonial feminists call it the modern colonial gender system. Right? At the heart of this system is this heterosexual model or this heteronormativity, right?
Mhm,
Where
mhm.
the norm is to be heterosexual, right? But this role of heteronormativity is really to reproduce whiteness for capital,
Mm.
right? And that's how gender and sexuality as categories are related to the question of race, right? Yeah, and yeah. So I'm going
I
on and
know.
on, but
I love
It's
all
so
these
good.
words. There
No.
was hetero, gender, European. Wait, what was it? Wait,
Heteronormative.
heteronormative,
Yep.
gender, hetero, colonial
colonial gender
gender
system,
system.
right? Colonial
Colonial
gender
gender
system.
system.
Mm, mm.
Yes, yeah, that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Colonial gender system.
Totally. And it makes sense because that's almost like the foundation that we then use to replicate
Mm.
norms around gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that continues to be applied in different spaces and places.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so that is the foundational sort of
Mhm.
model, right, of sort of Western modernity. And it's used to understand how we understand gender and sexuality, but more crucially, race, right?
Okay, yeah.
Because like I said, the sort of the European bourgeoisie woman is used to reproduce race and capital, right, for the continuing of colonization. And
Mhm.
really this foundational model, right, of this European bourgeoisie man and European bourgeoisie woman, um, they they were they were regarded as the human,
Mhm.
right? The standard of what it means to be human, right? Fully human and fully civilized, right?
Mhm.
So they became the normative human,
Mhm.
right? And the standard from where we begin to judge, the colonized as less than human, as, sometimes bestial, non-gendered, promiscuous, overly sexual, and sinful, right? Because
Mm.
this were the normative Christian bourgeoisie men and women, right? So the role of this heteronormative model this model is actually installed to create a racial hierarchy, right? Yes, it influences how we understand gender and sexuality, but I would argue that its fundamental role is to install a racial hierarchy so that colonialism can continue, right, in its sort of um, economic desires for profit and extraction.
Okay. I love how it's immediately race and gender intrinsically
Yes.
linked
Yeah.
through colonization. And I think my big question is about, when I think of bourgeoisie, female, European, I'm like, it's such an alien. I mean, like, I do not relate to that. Yet it became the norm. How did this happen? Like, yes, I know colonization happened, but what are the other ways, that maybe invisible ways, that we don't see, that these norms are continuously being pushed as the dominant, or this is the default, this is what we will judge everything against? How does
Yeah.
that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of an ongoing force, right? I mean, if you think about here in the settler colony of Australia, right? So a lot of indigenous scholars like Eileen Morton Robinson, right, in The White Possessive, and Chelsea Retago in Another Day in the Colony, along with many more of their work and other indigenous scholars, they remind us that this norm is really used to reproduce settlers and eliminate indigenous peoples, right? And this elimination takes the form of overt violence in history, right? Such as policing against indigenous people, which is still happening.
Yes.
But it's also carried out very perniciously through structural means, right? That is the systematic deprivation of sort of proper healthcare, employment, and education to indigenous people, and making this the preserve of sort of white or whitened people, right? So our migrants are whitened too, and we're able to get jobs here because we resemble the white person, right? And so this norm works to continually differentiate who deserves, right? Who gets to be the proper subject of the human, right? Deserving of this really quite basic infrastructures of life, which is education, employment, right? And other conditions of living.
So,
Yeah.
Sorry.
no, it's great. I love it. No,
Good
I love
morning.
it.
Good
Good morning.
How's that for breakfast?
Oh, it's fantastic. So just to pull that thread further, so the way in which we understand gender and sexuality is threaded across our social structures, including, as you said, health, but also education, welfare, legal. Can you tell us more about that in different examples that may play out, and how that's, again, reproducing the foundation of what you shared?
How that so I mean I keep returning to the question of race, because to me it's just so intertwined, right? Like if you think about I mean there's also, I mean there's for instance quite a lot of news and sort of academic coverage on how when indigenous women sort of present at the hospitals for various ailments, their illnesses and their condition is sort of denied, or they're not properly treated, right? And they get sent away, right? And then they suffer the consequences of not getting proper medical treatment because of dominantly racialized stereotype of how much a black or an indigenous body can tolerate pain, for instance, right? So then an indigenous woman who is a gendered subject but is simultaneously a racialized subject, gets denied medical treatment. Yeah, did I answer your question?
No, it did very much so. No, there's practical examples, because I know I've looked at a lot of that stuff over the years as well, around the way in which gender and sexuality is performed in that white and Western context, but this idea of it being racialized from the beginning fascinates me, because I agree. I think it's inextricably connected. You can't have gender and sexuality without the race elements.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think what has happened, I mean, gender and sexuality, they are the more sort of, to me, palatable categories. People don't like to talk about race, right? And because people don't like to talk about race, and especially I find race literacy quite low in Australia. gender and sexuality as categories become then these dominant categories that we think about, we theorize, we discuss, but always abstracted from race, right? And so just thinking about gender and sexuality in the abstract actually does a lot of disservice, right? So going back to this whole scenario of students coming in to say that, I just want to talk about my gender and sexuality, and to some extent these are the sexy things to say, right? When you name a course and you sort of include the word gender or queer or
Sold out.
sexuality, yeah, students
I
enroll
agree.
massively, right? And then you say you want to talk about race, not that relevant,
Oh, I'll sign up for that class.
Mm.
That's just me.
Oh, I like
or,
that.
or maybe I shouldn't say not that relevant, just less exciting as a category compared to gender and sexuality. So yeah, so I often want to emphasize just how entwined,
Mhm.
right? Race and gender and sexuality is.
So why do people not want to include the race element in gender and sexuality? I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah, I mean,
Because as you said, it's not as
Yeah.
sexy as the other.
yeah, I was being a bit flippant. But why? I mean, I don't know. It's such a big question that we don't take questions of race to be really fundamental of how life is organized and
Mhm.
understood,
Mhm.
right? And I mean, to put it bluntly, sometimes gender and sexuality are kind of distractions from just the foundational category of race. And I can't really explain why, except maybe to say that we basically live in a world that is defined by whiteness, right? And so discussing questions of race is always secondary to um, sort of concerns over gender and sexuality, right? So like even the feminist movement, right? It was a white feminist movement that came to the fore, right? In the 60s, in the West, right? In Australia, but also in Europe and in the US. And the feminism was actually really white, right? But the whiteness of the feminism and its concerns around bodily autonomy, and the right to vote, right? Were really white feminism's concerns because racialized people for a long time were not even allowed to vote.
Yeah. It's like, oh,
Right?
that's normal.
Yeah, but yet that,
Yeah.
that whiteness is not always named. I always think as feminist. We always think of the feminist movement as just the feminist movement.
Mhm.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know if I answered your question.
You have no.
Yeah.
I've got some follow-up questions, but definitely for the next section
Yeah.
on decolonize. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
and,
Yeah.
and I wonder, to me, it's just trying to answer your question as well. Like, why are people avoiding it? I wonder if there is also a sense of denial, or kind of like you don't want to confront that truth. So then,
Thank you for using a D word.
oh yeah, D, the fourth D, denial. Maybe it's that. I don't know if
Yeah.
if I mean I'm not an academic. It's just something that I have observed. It's like there is, because the truth hurts, right? You start confronting your race. That means you start confronting the cruelty of colonization, and then confronting also how was I complicit in that. And I guess it's such a heavy thing to confront, and that's why it's like, okay, I'm just gonna put that aside and just focus on gender. Maybe I
Yeah.
don't know if
I
that's
mean,
a fair.
Yeah, no, that's 100% accurate. And I don't mean to say that gender and sexuality issues are unimportant,
Yeah.
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
But I
mhm.
mean, we are talking about decolonizing today,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? So I did want to make sure that we sort of recenter race,
Yeah,
right? As this
absolutely.
thing that we are decolonizing. And I completely get you. I mean, I think that talking about race is a really uncomfortable thing,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, and also as migrants or being in a white settler society, right? We are, as you say, complicit in sort of occupying indigenous land, right? And sometimes I describe myself as a runner-up settler. um, yeah, so it is it is uncomfortable. That's true, but also the going back to my point about how so living in colonial time, right, means that some things are more thinkable than others, right? If our sort of knowledge production dominantly assumes, um, or is dominantly sort of white knowledge production, right? Then we don't really think about race, right? For example, if we think about feminism, right, in the terms of sort of white knowledge production, then we don't even have to question how it was white feminism that was, that was that historical events in the 70s in the West. I'm just rambling now, but
Not at all. And I think it's part of that bigger picture, as you were suggesting. Denial is River. Shout out to Dochi for the second time in our podcast series.
Dochi, another D.
Another
Should
D,
be our
that's
next
right.
guest.
Join us. But also, plug, shout out to the Handbook of Critical Whiteness, which is a handbook that I edited and led. And that further talks to this idea of the Western and white dominance of these perspectives and the way in which they permeate the world around us. Before, though, we go on to the next section, I just wanted to ask, sex, sexuality, gender, how do they differ? Because I think it's important that we people think that sexuality and gender obviously is its own thing, of course, but then also sex is a different thing. And I just wanted to sort of highlight those categories just to provide further nuance to potentially what we might be discussing in the next section.
Yeah, so the question is, what's the difference between sex, sexuality, and gender? Yeah, so I mean, in sort of dominant knowledge production, right? Sex is this thing that is to do with the body, right? So what sex the body is, so it's sort of as a physiological thing, right? Sexuality, one might say that it has to do with your sort of sexual identity and your sort of sexual orientation, right? And then gender has to do with how you it's to do how you think of yourself, whether as man or woman, or now trans, non-binary,
So sex is the physical attributes that you may have when you were born. Sexuality is your sexual orientation. And that's the other thing. So everyone has a sexuality, because I think sometimes when we think about sexuality, we just go, oh, it's queerness. And it's like, no. Everyone has a sexual orientation. So I think it's really important to highlight that. And then gender, as you said, is that socialization of what we're expected to be in the context of those other things.
Yes. Yeah. But, we could also think about gender as a system, right? So going back to what
Gender
I
as a system.
spoke about earlier on sort of the modern colonial gender system, right? Gender then becomes this instrument or mechanism to organize social life itself.
Okay. Yeah. And then, as you said, and you've suggested, there's a racialized element across those things with sex, sexuality, and gender.
Yes.
Okay.
I need to remember this. MCGS, Modern Colonial Gender System.
Very good.
Yes,
Very nice
MCGS. MCGS. Come on, MCGS.
And on that note, let's segue to the second section that I keep on preempting to our conversation, where we're going to decolonize. And we're now going to look...
Smooth, Chochi. Very smooth.
Very, very smooth. Call me. So we're now going to look at this topic area of gender and sexuality from a different point of view. I want to talk more around the different forms of feminism that may exist, especially when it comes to understanding gender and sexuality.
different forms of feminism.
Yeah, so I know that there's black feminism, indigenous
Mhm,
feminism. How
mhm,
does that
mm.
help us to potentially see gender and sexuality from a different perspective?
Mm. Yeah, okay. So if you think about um, sort of black feminism, um, sorry, so your question is how do we think about gender and sexuality from sort of the different feminisms? So black feminism is always tied to sort of material questions of um, poverty and unemployment and um, um, sorry, I'm just losing
No,
my
that's
my
It's
okay.
okay.
my train
Take
of
your
thought.
time.
Yeah, yeah,
Please take your time.
yeah. I guess what I would say is black feminism's concerns is always tied to racialized concerns, right? And so if you think about some of the issues that sort of black people face, right, in terms of not being able to secure basic conditions of
Mm.
living, right, in terms of being deprived, proper access to sort of employment, healthcare, education, and also the questions of incarceration, right, high rates of incarceration. So, black feminism, right, understands gender as it is tied to these material issues.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
So, if you were, for example, a black feminist mother, right, um, you would not just be worrying about the question of patriarchy in the abstract,
mhm,
Mhm.
right?
mhm,
Teaching your sons about not being patriarchal, right, and treating
mhm,
women right, right, which is a lot of sort of white feminism and is concerned with gender equality. Right? Um, if you were sort of a black feminist mother, you would have so many other concerns about your sort of son growing up in a world, right, that is going to systematically um, disenfranchise him,
Mm.
right? Yeah, along these many fronts. Right? So black feminist concerns are just that much different from, say, white feminism,
mhm,
right? And indigenous feminisms would also would always be tied to question of colonial land theft and extraction,
Yeah.
right? Because if feminism is about thinking about how women but also men flourish, right? Um, as political subjects, then the question for indigenous families would always be that how would I be able to flourish in a settler colony, right?
mhm,
Where
mhm,
land and possession is entirely in the hands of the white settler.
mhm. And I can hear from what you're saying, in my understanding
Mm.
also of black and indigenous feminism, it's also underpinned by the collective and the reciprocal
Mm.
nature of gender expressions. So it's not necessarily one over the other. It's actually the collective context of coming together as
Mm.
different gender expressions.
Mm. So are you talking about how um perhaps black and indigenous feminisms kind of um are more accepting of sort of collective and multiple expressions of gender and sexuality?
Yeah, from my understanding, it's this idea that it's not necessarily trying to have complete autonomy
Mm.
from the dominant patriarchy. It's
Mm.
about how does it complement and or how do we provide. So as you're saying before with Black feminist mother, they're concerned about their young son's ability to function in the world,
Mhm.
but how does Black feminists also support their young sons to also flourish, knowing also that there's also those other challenges. So it's not
Mm.
about the autonomy, it's about the collective
Yeah.
and that
Yes.
communal
Right.
approach to
Yeah.
gender.
Yes.
From my understanding.
Yes. Yes. And yeah, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, and so I would say that their concerns and their political investments are probably really broad based, right? Um, and um, and because their concerns are broad based, they just sort of tie up with the concerns of different constituencies, right? Constituencies who are just Sorry, I lost my chain of thought.
No, it's fantastic.
I have a question, and maybe I'm afraid that maybe it's a little bit wrong or contentious. But because I really like what you said about the different concerns, and like if it's a like white feminism, they would put a premium on, let's say, the women's right to vote, and that's not necessarily a concern that would be a top priority for all other women in the world. Like for brown women, maybe the right to vote wouldn't be like in our top one, for example. So I think I'm curious. I'm scared, and we can cut this out.
No, this is safe space. Safe
Yeah.
space.
So in the same way, for example,
Yeah.
this and this is separate to feminism. I guess how pronouns, for example, have become a central idea in, let's say, how people understand or express gender. And to me, I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing, but like, would that be the same concern, for example, for people who are not white, for others? Because it's like, if you're, for example, trans or non-binary in another country, your concerns of gender would be very different from pronouns. It would be probably even just the right to decriminalize, like for example, like that would be my top priority. It's be like, well, in my country, being queer is a crime, and that is my top priority, not necessarily being referred to with the right pronoun. So to me, I think it's very interesting, the difference in what we prioritize and what we put forward as the agenda or the advocacy that we're trying to change in the world.
It's a scary topic.
I know. That's why I'm like,
because people are really sensitive about their pronouns,
yeah.
right? And it has become such a dominant politics.
It is,
right? For sexual and gender minorities, and there's so much policing around gender pronouns, right? That it becomes such a scary thing to discuss.
Hold hands.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, queer people, or non-normative gender and sexual people, have so many more concerns than their pronouns, right? And I mean, even in Singapore, it was only recently that being gay has been decriminalized, right? And so those kinds of politics, that politics to fight the decriminalization was definitely more pressing than the politics of gender pronouns, right? And also, just to think about how that sort of gender pronoun politics is in fact quite a white politics, we might think about language, right? It's like in the Chinese language or in Mandarin, we use ta to refer to whether you're a man or woman, right? It's the same.
Same in the Philippines. It's the same pronoun.
So
it's sha.
And it's similar. We have in the Pacific indigenous languages, they're all very different, but it's similar sort of thing in regards to the gender neutral language that is used across different languages.
So there is less sort of boundary maintaining, right, over your gender identity or your sexual identity in that ways, right, across different cultures. So to the extent that there is that boundary making, that is conditioned by both race and language.
So there's still a colonial framing around the way in which we understand these terminology and language. And that's quite interesting, because I think that's the thing also around sexuality. I know that in a lot of countries prior to colonization, gender and sexuality was fluid. It wasn't confined or defined. I actually have a TED talk about this. I'm just plugging all over the place today, aren't I?
I was
Just-
plugging in the last episode, so this is yours. This is your jam. I'm gonna step aside as the straight person in this. I'm the cisgendered white man now.
So yeah, check out my TED talk. But basically, it was talking about how through colonization we learnt to fear the queer and to also see ourselves as sexualized entities, physical entities that were to be moralized as opposed to be socialized, which is what we did in our gender and sexual expressions. Do you find that continues to create tensions for Western perspectives on gender and sexuality? And do you think there's scope for that to be meaningfully incorporated or included somehow?
What do you mean by tensions? I mean,
So if you were to explain to Western audiences that there's a reclamation that's happening in like the Pacific around these particular principles and practices, and even the idea of your sexuality or your gender identity can be one and the same thing rather than actually separated. So for Western audiences, they may say, "Oh, that's not what we know," but I suggest that you could learn a lot from pre-colonial Pacific perspectives on gender and sexuality. So do you think that is that's a possibility, or again there's the tensions and sort of the inability to recognize and have that as part of the everyday?
Yeah, I mean there is definitely that tension felt mostly by sort of non-Western sort of queer politics, right? Where there is that imperative to sort of keep, like you say, reclaiming, right? Naming, recognizing, excavating, recovering.
All these
the
R
sort
words.
of-
Oh.
the sort of so there is an imperative, right, on the non-Western queer
Yes.
to reclaim, right, all these
Interesting.
diverse genders and sexualities, right, across all non-Western societies as a decolonizing move or strategy, right? And then there is that related argument that it was colonization that was the pivotal moment in which queerphobia or homophobia specifically was introduced, right? So like for example, the British brought Section 377A to Singapore when it colonized Singapore, and that particular penal code criminalized gay sex between men, right? So there is that. So you often hear this argument among sort of non-Western queer scholars and activists that homophobia is actually Western, right? Because they brought these laws and the colonizers came and they imposed these laws and heteronormativity when we had far more diverse genders and sexualities, right? So scholars and activists, right, in the non-Western world, they are quite invested, as I said, to recovering these histories and providing these recuperative accounts of diverse genders and sexualities. I had a few more thoughts about that though. As a form of politics, right? Because I mean, as a gender and cultural studies scholar, we're always thinking about how to refine our gender and sexuality politics, or how do we refine our politics, right? And to me, and since we're talking about decolonizing, right, this way of sort of recuperating diverse gender and sexualities across non-Western contexts is ultimately quite a limited politics, particularly as a decolonial politics, right? And why do I say that? Right? I think there are two reasons, right? At least one is that it tends in trying to recuperate, right, diverse genders and sexualities, we sometimes run the risk of producing exoticizing or orientalizing accounts, right, of the local and the non-Western, right? And then sometimes we run the risk of creating this impression that sort of non-Western societies are these sort of hyper-sexualized societies, full of lust and unbridled desires, right? That plays into this sort of Orientalist colonizing colonial fantasies, right? In short, it reproduces a kind of white gaze on the
Right.
non-Western society, right? And also linking back earlier to that model of the heteronormative bourgeoisie, sort of Christian men and women, they saw themselves as the proper subjects of rule precisely because they could distinguish themselves from the lust and sexualized, the lustful and the sexualized, racialized other,
Yeah.
right?
It's a higher ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we say we want to recuperate, how thriving our sort of genders and sexualities were in a non-Western context, sometimes we run into this problem or this risk of reproducing that very orientalizing and racializing account, right? So which is why I say it can be a kind of limited politics. Now, the second reason I say it can be a kind of limited politics is that we also then romanticize the sort of pre-colonial space, right, as some kind of uniquely tolerant space when there were real sort of antipathies and hostilities, right, against non-normative sexualities and genders, which we don't want to sort of romanticize away because we need to pay attention seriously pay attention to these problems, right? That were not exempt of non-Western societies, right? They too can be quite hostile and homophobic, right? Like in Singapore, right? The British colonizers came and they institutionalized Section 377A, right? But they weren't really interested in enforcing it unless um, unless it affected their they weren't really interested in enforcing on the local population unless it affected their ability to extract, and continue their economic exploitation. Right? So they didn't really police Section 377A, right? And there's some research showing that only when some of these British administrators, right, and colonizers, and soldiers and sailors, when they themselves were caught, having sex with men or visiting some male prostitutes, right, and then being held to extortion, right, and then the risk of that becoming a scandal was when they actively enforced Section 377A and put in jail all these male prostitutes and these sort of Asian gay men that they saw as baiting, these colonial administrators, right? But that's only because when these scandals erupt, it would affect their respectability and their ability to
Their
hold
authority.
power, their authority, which they need for economic exploitation and extraction, right? So the point is that they didn't really care about enforcing 377 on the local population unless it affected their economic interests, right? And then the British left and the law stayed in the books, and it was the local post-colonial leaders, right? So after colonization, we had this colonial leaders these post-colonial leaders who came in. They were the ones who actually more actively enforce this regime, right? Policing gay and queer people, because they wanted to prove themselves to be modern, right? More modern than the British, in fact. Right, so these questions of modernity and race, right, all sort of play out quite spectacularly when it comes to questions of gender and sexuality.
Fascinating.
I know. I just so like.
I know history
Yeah.
and the way in which it influences today.
Yeah.
Which is a nice segue to our third and final section on disrupting.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe we're here. Yeah, I was like, I had so many questions.
Well, this is where Dr. Tang will challenge us. She will come up with a question, a challenge based on the conversation that we've had and the broader topic area around sexuality and gender.
Yeah.
So what is the challenge that you'll come up with?
Okay.
And Happy gets to
I'm
go
gonna go
first.
first. Okay.
I suppose if you were to think of yourself as a racialized subject, right, simultaneous to your sort of gender and sexual identity, right? And you both are very active in your communities,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
What sort of how would that shape your sort of organizing in the communities that you're in? Yes.
So
Oh.
so seeing myself as
As a
racialized identity
Mhm.
and talking about how that affects the way I organize
Mm.
my community.
Yeah, as a say cis heterosexual
Yeah.
woman. Yeah.
Oh.
Is that a clear question?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. It's hard.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
It's a
Okay.
great question.
I know.
Should we role play? No, I'm just joking.
Yeah.
It's like, what?
Uh,
do you hold privileges as a sort of cis
Mm.
heterosexual woman in your community compared to a sort of queer person, I suppose?
right. Yes. Um yes. Okay, so then I think the awareness of that privilege then gosh, I don't know how to answer this question. Chuchi.
Oh,
Okay. Go, go,
I'm
go.
invested. I'm like,
No.
what is she going to come up with?
Um
I can.
so as in like so do you want me to self-reflect and kind of be aware of that, or do I then imagine what is a different way that I can
Yeah.
shift my behavior,
Okay.
or no I can
So
Georgie can
this is
answer
a
first.
difficult question.
No,
You know,
it's
it's
okay,
a
it's okay.
great
We
question.
always had difficult questions.
Do you want to
I'm
go
just very
first?
competitive and I'm like I want to be very good. Yeah.
You are going to be
Yeah.
very good.
No.
Trust. Trust the
Trust
process.
process. Okay. Okay, I think the feeling and the experience of a racialized woman, Asian woman, Filipino woman, I
Mhm.
think I have felt that throughout my entire adult life. I have felt that, just it's like when I'm talking to a white man, I'm like, is he? It's either I feel that he's sexualizing me or undermining me. I mean, not both are not good things, but you know what I mean? Like, I always have this tension of like, oh, he's talking to me. Is he, you know what I mean? Like, Filipino women have always been subject to being exoticized and sexualized and very much objectified in the white gaze. So I'm very familiar with that. I never really thought about how that has then affected the way I talk to um, fellow fellow Filipinas. I guess I think I think it's something. It's sort of like because we know it, we don't really talk about it, and me also. I hardly talk about it because I don't want people to think I'm weird. Like, what do you mean? Like you're overreading the situation. It's like, no, but I know that gaze. He's looking at me in a different way. And back in my active dating life, I'm married now. So I was like, back in my active dating life, it was always this question that I struggled with. I'm like, do you really like me for who I am? Like, can you see me, or do you just like me because you think I look different? I look because I'm exotic to you and therefore a hot Asian woman. And so, yeah, I guess I never really thought about how that then translates to, if that has turned into biases, if that has turned into something that has really shaped the way I see things and therefore unconsciously behave in a different way. I think that's why it's a hard question, because I never stopped to think about it. When I think of, defining a Filipino space, creating a space for Filipinos, I never really thought of gender.
Yeah.
To me it was just like, you're all here, come together. I never really, it I was never aware of it.
Yeah, I mean it's so interesting because you talked about how when the Filipino community comes together to
Yeah.
create space,
Yeah.
it's supposed to be a safe space,
Yeah.
right? And precisely because there's so many levels of unsafety when you're out of that space,
Yeah.
right? You talked about how when you're seen as some kind of a sort of sexualized or gendered subject,
Yeah.
um, you you can't really figure out what it is, right? That draws another person's attention, and if the attention comes in the form of a cat call, right? You're wondering, is it because of my gender,
Yeah.
right? Is it because of my sort of sexuality,
Yeah.
or is it because of my race, right?
Yeah.
So you need to be vigilant actually on multiple fronts,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
the level of unsafety is multiplied that way, right? Because you're at once a gendered, sexualized, and racialized subject,
Yeah.
right? Which makes your sense of vigilance that much more heightened,
Yeah.
and therefore makes that Filipino space,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 'Cause
Really
I
a
feel,
safe space on so
yeah.
many levels,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Because sometimes it could be you don't realize it, but you do it to each other.
Mm.
Like that white gaze is
Mm.
carried over in the Filipino community, and just because it's another Filipino talking to me, it doesn't mean that they're exempt, because sometimes it's like, yeah, because you don't see it, and and all those expectations that come with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's also some level of sort of safety and certainty
Yes.
when
Mm.
you are
Yeah.
in your community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
I go back to Singapore, I was like,
Yeah,
I
like you
can
can
be
exhale,
less,
like,
I can be
yeah.
less vigilant, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. That was a
Yeah.
great.
Well done, Happy. See, you did it. Got some claps by Don and Marv at the back there. Well
Yeah.
done. Okay, so my answer. So how does my race impact my understanding of gender and sexuality in the context of my community? It's interesting because I reflect on this in my TED Talk.
Link below.
Link below in the show notes. That's right. Call me. It's actually through my Fijian indigenous perspectives on gender and sexuality that helped me to reconcile my own gender and sexuality, because growing up in a Western context here in Australia, I always struggled with the labels and this idea of even the binaries, because traditionally I've identified as bisexual. So, bisexual, biracial, like in trying to understand what am I attracted to, who should I be interacting with, how am I perceived. But then when I learned about the pre-colonial histories, but even I've done a bit of research now in the Pacific around gender and sexual diversities, what I've learned is in a lot of our cultures, we don't really, we don't make it a thing that you're diverse from a sexual or gender point of view, as long as you contribute to the collective. Like if you're still turning up and supporting your family and your community, no one cares who you're kissing, or how you express yourself from a gender point of view, because it goes back to you're still part of the collective. You're still part of something bigger. And so I think that really helped me to go, okay, I feel like I belong now, because before I struggled with feeling like I belonged. And so I think that for me, that has helped me to reconcile. So it's not completely perfect. I mean, there's still spaces, even when I go to Fiji and other areas of the Pacific, I'm always conscious about my queerness. But at the same time, I'm like, no, if I'm, turning up and still being involved, and, a lot of the time, any form of gender and sexuality, you don't publicly show those things. So irrespective of queerness, you just don't hold hands or make out in public. So that's the thing, right? So that's the thing as well. So I've just learned that if I'm just turning up and turning out, I'm fine, and I can just be who I am.
Yeah.
Great.
What do you think?
Fantastic.
What do you think about my answer,
Yeah.
Dr. Tang?
As perfect as your TED Talk.
Oh!
I struggled with my answers, so I will give
No.
this win to you.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. No, it's not a competition.
No, that's right. But
But
I want to hear from Dr. Tang.
Yes.
What's your answer to that question?
Okay, didn't expect this turn to me.
Oh, this is when you can walk out.
That's right. Flip the table and walk out. Drama.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about, thinking about sort of community and organizing, um, and thinking about sort of like the Chinese community, queer community here. Um, it's interesting that they think of um, themselves um, first in terms of their. No, this is not right. Yeah, they do. All right, anyways, let me think again.
course.
Yeah, how do I yeah, I didn't expect this question to be turned. Yeah, I would say that yeah, I would say that in kind of like the community work that I do in the gender and sexuality space, and um because I'm so visible, right, as a queer sort of Chinese, I often get invited into these spaces to talk about gender and sexuality, right? But when I go into these spaces, right, as a sort of highly sort of racialized Chinese subject, I often am inclined to talk about Chineseness, right? Um, as part of our gender and sexuality politics, right? And Chineseness doesn't. It's not just a minoritized position, especially with the rise of China, right, and its power, right? So going to sort of these community spaces on queer community spaces and thinking about Chineseness means to sort of take seriously and grapple with our sort of complicity, right? Um, as rather powerful subjects, right? In this global context, we are not just minoritized or marginalized um, gender and sexual subjects, right? We are in fact um, part of this rising wave of um, Chinese racial dominance, right? With a lot of economic power, right? Yeah. So I guess this is how I think about my race in this sort of gender and sexuality spaces with my community. That's to constantly remind ourselves that yes, we may be sort of sexual and gender minorities, but how do we think about that in relation to our race and really the economic power we hold, right? To be able to sort of migrate,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
have an overseas education, right?
So
and work
interesting.
overseas, right? So what are our sort of ethical responsibilities as minority subjects besides advocating for our sort of gender and sexuality concerns, right? We do need to grapple with the power that we hold.
A plus 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 plus. That was wonderful because I just love how you thought of that more broadly in the context of your identity.
And also now then made me reflect about the privilege of your proximity to whiteness, and then therefore because I'm closer to whiteness now, because I'm a migrant, I speak English, I fit the mold. Being aware of that actually, this is a privilege, and this is because we are subscribing to that power dynamic of white is might and white is strength.
I love that you're thinking about proximity to whiteness. Because as a sort of queer person, or ostensibly queer person in Australia, right? I actually feel that I have a lot of cultural capital because my queerness, right, is intelligible to whiteness. But if I was just a straight sort of cis presenting Asian subject, I actually would be considered less white and taken less seriously, right? So my partner, right, who is she is this sort of femme presenting Asian migrant woman, she cops a lot more racism than I do. And I think it's because my queerness wins me some cultural capital where I'm intelligible to white people, and therefore I experience far less racism than she does. And so queerness is a kind of capital, not just an injury. Right? We often think that queer people are oppressed, but the reverse may well be true.
Damn.
Oh.
And we end on that?
I know, right?
Like we need the extension. Additional class. Yeah.
Totally.
I want more homework.
Another fascinating conversation, and what a wonderful way to end our initial series of Decolonise Me. Thank you so much, Dr. Shawna Tang, for joining us. It's been a wonderful, reflective conversation. And of course, an encouragement to yourself. How do you see your race influence your space and place in the community around gender and sexuality? And I'm hoping that through your shared journey with us in this first season of Decolonise Me, that it's provided you with further provocations and possibilities to think about what it means to be part of a global world beyond just the dominant way of looking at things.
Yes. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you for another season. That's up to you if you share this and like it and share it to all your friends and keep listening to it.
That's it. Follow us on socials, and we look forward to continuing this shared conversation together.
See ya.
You've just been watching the Decolonise Me podcast, hosted by Georgie Ravulo and Happy Ferrarin. For more details about the topics discussed, please see the show notes and follow us on all social media platforms.